Welcome all. Thank you for joining us. My name is Francesca Guerrero. I'm a partner in Thompson Hine's International Trade Practice Group. Joining me today is my colleague Brittain Shaw. Brittain is a partner in the firm's white-collar defense and investigations practice. We would like to welcome you to today's webinar. This is the 8th in a series of webinars examining what the shift in presidential power can mean for the country. And today we'll be examining the latest in trade crimes enforcement. Before we begin, and as people are joining us, a few housekeeping items. Today's program is being recorded and we will send a link to you within the next few days. This presentation is intended for the general information of individuals and organizations on matters of current interest, and the thoughts and opinions expressed today are those of myself and Brittain and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the panel members, clients, employers, affiliates, or Thompson Hine. Also, this content should not be taken as advice. The views expressed here are for informational purposes only. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to use the question box located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. We will answer as many of the questions as we can at the end of the webinar. I will try to keep track, and if any of them are particularly pertinent, we will also address them during the webinar. CLE credit for today's webinar is pending. Please be sure to complete the verification of attendance survey. The link to the survey is posted in the chat. We will also paste the link in the chat at the end of the program. I will announce the attendance tracking code at the end of the program. In the handout panel, you can also download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and bios of today's speakers. Again, thank you for your interest, and if you have questions as we go along, please use the question box. And we are going to jump right in. Transition. Trade crimes enforcement forecast. So today's agenda includes external factors driving trade crime, what we think the trade crime enforcement focus is and will be, ways that you can maximize compliance and minimize the likelihood of committing a trade crime in your company, and then we will talk about preparing for and responding to enforcement. So again, we're going to set the table and then we're going to talk about what to do. External factors driving trade crime, as I put there, tariffs, tariffs, more tariffs. And it's, the simplest thing to say is that when tariffs are virtually zero, people aren't spending that much time and energy trying to figure out how to avoid them. And when tariffs are going up and fluctuating, people start spending time thinking about how to mitigate tariffs. There are a lot of legally compliant ways to try and mitigate tariffs, and I and the trade team have spent many hours over the last couple of months talking to companies about this. But there are also a lot of ways that are not proper and potentially criminal or fraudulent, or both. So for example, valuation. I've gotten questions lately about whether you need to include certain costs in the value. And these are genuine questions, but if you're intentionally not including something in the value that is legally required to be included, you could have a fraudulent valuation. That can be a criminal action. We've also seen in the past, bubbling up recently, questions about dual invoicing. So that's something permitted in the customs context where you're importing a good, and the value for customs purposes might actually be different than what the sort of invoice you paid to the immediate seller was, and so you have a different invoice. But it becomes deceptive when those invoices are not intended to comply with customs regulations, but they're intended to essentially make the value look lower so you pay less tariffs. So when you start looking at dual invoicing, that's a situation where you need to be especially careful And if the government realizes that that's happening, they will scrutinize it closely as, a red flag for fraud. So again, and I guess maybe I should have table set even more, but I think everyone knows tariffs have gone up a lot. We've got tariffs on Canada, we've got tariffs on Mexico, we've got tariffs on China. We might have tariffs on other countries coming April 2nd, countries in the European Union, countries in South America, other countries in Asia. So when we say tariffs, tariffs, and more tariffs, we mean that the Trump administration thinks tariffs are a very important tool for foreign policy, and they are imposing them for many purposes. We had an earlier session, which I think you can still access and watch if you didn't have a chance, and that got into the what, why, and how of tariffs. But for our purposes, I just want you to know there's lots of different tariffs coming under this administration, lots of reasons. That's why you get this pressure to try and reduce your value so that the duty you pay, the tariff you pay, is less. When people are looking for ways to reduce it, you see more customs fraud. There's also going to be people who are thinking, oh, it's a great idea to take this good from China and send it to Thailand or Brazil or whatever, and then import to the United States and say it came from Brazil. So that's essentially transshipment. And you will see more and more of that. In fact, we've seen it already with the tariffs that were imposed on China under the last two administrations. So transshipment, trying to avoid these country-specific tariffs. You're also going to see a more sophisticated version where someone might move the product to another country, do a little bit with it, and then say, okay, now it's a product of that country. But if it's not sufficient, like whatever processing happens in that new country, if it's not sufficient to really change the country of origin, then potentially, again, you could have something fraudulent. I have a little note here because I think it's interesting that the European Union has a rule that says if you move production solely to avoid tariffs, they essentially impose the original tariff on you. So they don't consider that a business justification. So if you're thinking about moving for tariffs, talk to your EU counsel about, how to manage that issue. The other issue, which is related to tariffs, is logistics pressure. So we're going to see people trying to maybe bring goods in quickly, trying to use warehouses, inventory record keeping, and there might be some temptation to essentially fudge dates so that you can avoid tariffs that appear out of almost nowhere, one day or appear the next day. We also see pressure to move goods quickly, to sort of get things out before tariffs that you see coming down the pike. And that may mean that you're using new logistics partners. You're like, I need to get this from A to B. My usual carrier can't do it. I'm going to use the low rent truck carrier that I didn't use before. And that may mean that you're using new logistics partners that you haven't vetted, and they may be more likely to let smugglers use your containers to bring goods into the country. So again, this is just sort of setting the atmosphere. There's a lot of pressure companies are feeling around tariffs. That may lead to people making bad choices. And again, companies are telling employees possibly mixed messages. We've got to get the things in. We've got to get it in cheaply. Are we continuing to give the culture of compliance message, or is that maybe being a little bit drowned out by some of the other concerns? That's another reason we expect to see just a rise in action in the next year or two. A third reason that we expect this to be more of an issue, another external factor really, is that there's a lot of cartel activity. This sort of bleeds into what, Brittain will talk about, which is like the fact that the administration is targeting these cartels. But the cartels are looking to legitimize, go into real business, kind of like The Godfather, and you might think that you're dealing with a legitimate business, but it has connections to cartels. This is especially a North American issue. Coupled with the enforcement focus Brittain will talk about, that makes this a very high risk area if you find out that you're actually doing business with someone with cartel connections. The fact that the administration is using the terrorist designation for cartels also opens a bunch of different potential violations up. So again, this is another risk area that might lead to an uptick in bad decisions or an uptick in mistakes because maybe we weren't doing enough due diligence about third parties. That could lead to criminal activity in the trade space. I wanted to talk about export controls and sanctions because we were talking tariffs. But one thing that's been true for several years is that export controls and sanctions have gotten more and more complicated. And there's lots of parties now that are sanctioned that, 10 years ago, you wouldn't have seen big multinational businesses really sanctioned or subject to export controls. It was more rare. Now you've got all sorts of companies that could be subject to these restrictions. And so it just means that the likelihood that you're dealing with a restricted party is greater. And the likelihood that, again, this could become a criminal issue because of the sensitivity or perhaps the culpability or even just because they want to prosecute something criminally. The complexity just makes it much harder to not violate the law. Even though the government maybe has switched gears towards tariffs away a bit from sanctions, sanctions and export controls have not gone away. We expect to see a continued focus on China and use of export controls, and we'll probably see it in some other spaces as well. So this is still a risk factor, external risk factor, leading to more trade crime. Again, another little note here for our people across the ocean. There's a relatively new UK offense, failure to prevent fraud. And that is similar to the failure to prevent bribery offense that they have in the corruption space. It's very interesting because it like bribery, if you all are familiar with this, under the UK regime, there's defenses if you have a compliant program. So something to look into when we're talking about trade crimes is also remember to think about other jurisdictions. So you've got a nice multilateral program. And I'm going to turn this over to Brittain. Thank you, Brittain. Tell me when you want me to move forward.
Okay, I'll tell you. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. So I wanted to talk about some of the enforcement priorities that the new administration has outlined. They've been all over the news for some weeks now. The first being immigration, illegal immigration. And I want to talk about how each of these priorities is going to bleed into an uptick in enforcement of trade crimes and what that means for you. So, as I said, we've seen the news about raids on, whether it's warehouses looking for undocumented workers, and how is that going to bleed into sort of a broader trade crime enforcement thing? Well, first off, with these ICE raids, you're going to have agents in your warehouses looking for the undocumented persons, but there's also going to be the risk that other things will be uncovered, whether it's shipments and so forth. So we're going to have that bleed. But then secondarily, once the sort of crush of illegal immigration enforcement raids, die down, we're going to see, I think, an increase in sort of the tariff enforcement. And the same partners, law enforcement partners, whether it's DHS, CBP, even DOJ, are going to sort of use those resources for warehouse raids and so forth. The other agenda item for enforcement was trafficking, drugs, human trafficking. And again, how does that relate to trade? Well, it's fairly simple. There's going to be a greater scrutiny of containers coming in, whether that's shipping containers, trucks, and so forth. Documentation is going to be scrutinized like never before. And so, of course, while the initial instinct would be for law enforcement to be looking for drugs and human trafficking, other things are going to get picked up in the midst, even assuming that their first interest was just drugs and human trafficking. So again, when they turn the focus more to tariffs, customs, documentation, all of those things are going to be scrutinized in a much greater degree. Lastly, and I think the most important for organizations operating in sort of a global supply chain and having global subsidiaries, is the national security focus announced by the administration, which is the total elimination of transnational criminal organizations and designating cartels as part of a terrorist network. And what does that mean? Well, it means that, like never before, companies that do business in any sort of hotspot, whether that's Mexico, certain parts of the Middle East that might be under terrorist control or influence, other parts of South America, all of those areas are going to have to do a lot better job of knowing what's going on the ground, because one of the things that we'll talk about shortly, the next slide, Francesca, please, is how the various other policies are informing trade enforcement and things that you might have been doing in the past, and how those are going to become much more fraught. So, for example, the whole America First policy, which is, again, I think part of what's informing the tariff rollout, they want to level the playing field for American businesses. And so what does that mean for you? Well, it means that, to the extent that, you may have someone doing a lot of the things that Francesca just talked about in terms of fudging for tariffs. You may have competitors that are going to be whistleblowers that are going to be coming in and, wanting to announce how you're disadvantaging another company. The other part of this that we've seen is there's a decentralization from main justice in Washington. I mean, we're seeing that sort of the overall focus is let's get everything out of DC, whether it's law enforcement or otherwise. But what does that mean for trade enforcement? I think what we're going to see is the movement of resources to the U.S. attorney's offices across the country, which means that cases that in the past might not have been fully prosecuted because of a resource problem are probably going to have that. And I'll just back up by saying, at Main Justice, where I spent some time, a lot of the cases that we did were in the 50 million and up kind of cases, super big ones. And those were big, and we would do those because the U.S. attorney's offices didn't have the resources to do that. With the shift to the U.S. attorney's offices, I think that we're going to see maybe not the super huge cases, but we're going to see the resources used to bring a lot more of the under, 50 million, under 10 million, smaller cases, because they can do those quickly, efficiently. You're going to see much swifter prosecutions. Again, this is not a negative on Main Justice, it's just a fact. Things at Main Justice were much more, had many more layers of approval. When you move to the U.S. attorney's offices, because of the volume of cases that they have, the triage of cases and the approvals goes much faster. So you will see more, not only through this rollout and increase of resources, but simply because it's a more efficient system for prosecuting, and it has to be because of the way it's, the dockets are and so forth.
Right.
Yes.
Oh, we had a question that I think touches on some of what you've been saying. It might be more for me to answer, but maybe we'll both have thoughts here. It says if there's going to be greater scrutiny on incoming containers, well, we need to expect greater delays as there's also less staff to do this. I don't really know that across the board you should expect delays. But it does mean that there will probably be more containers that might specifically be delayed because they're scrutinizing something about them. And until resources are really allocated properly, it might take a little while to resolve that, perhaps longer than you would like. So essentially what I'm saying is they might pull something because they think it's fishy, and that might take a while to resolve. But I don't necessarily think that means that all traffic coming in will expect delays. But did you have anything to add to this, Brittain? Do you have any thoughts about local enforcement on that front?
My only thought is that there will be greater scrutiny, certainly, and it's, again, this isn't rocket science, at the border, northern and southern border, to the extent that there already hasn't been scrutiny of containers. And that's, I think, just going to be increased. The question of more resources to do that, again, perhaps we'll see more hiring for those particular jobs. It wouldn't surprise me with the downsizing of other areas of government if resources are thrown at that. Finally, the last thing I would just note, and again, we're keeping an eye on this, there is a pending bill in Congress that is bipartisan and wants to create a DOJ unit that's going to be focused exclusively on trade crimes. And in particular, I think there's a large China focus to this bill, at least as it was originally conceived. Now, a couple things on this. First off, I'm not sure that creating a new DOJ unit is necessarily going to be something the new administration is going to do, at least at Main Justice, for all the reasons I just talked about, the decentralization. That said, I wouldn't be surprised if it goes through and through negotiations, we have sort of a national task force, trade crime task force that's rolled out to each U.S. Attorney's Office, or at least the key ones in trade borders and key cities. So to the extent that goes through, I think it means, it can only mean, A, that this is going to be an uptick because it's a bipartisan bill, there's support for it. And the other thing I would note is, while we've seen economic espionage cases over the years, I might expect an uptick on this. And of course, for organizations, that's where you're the victim, right? So, and particularly those in the IP and tech world, China, there's a real problem with this. So I would expect an uptick in that. And I guess the role for sort of whether you need counsel in that is when you do find out that you've been the victim of IP theft, economic espionage by, a foreign company, foreign actor, getting to the right person to report it is important, and sort of knowing what to do in terms of preserving evidence, or and making sure that if there's any US-based actors that they're not alerted. But again, that's a whole sort of section where it's different than, you have an employee making a bad decision in terms of tariff evasion. This is where you're the victim, but it's still, I think, going to be an uptick and something you should be, sort of prepared to deal with. And I think, so here is the, what I call the prosecutor's toolbox for trade crime. As you can see, there are lots of choices for the U.S. attorneys' offices around the country to use. The first off, and I'm not going to go through each one of these. Some of them are quite specialized to, customs and so forth. But the first one would be, False Claims Act criminal cases. And of course, when False Claims Act cases are, CBP or HSI are investigating those. If they find one that is, in their view, criminal, it's got to be referred to a U.S. Attorney's Office. Now, the standards for these offenses, it's higher. It's a higher mens rea, knowingly, and so there's a much higher burden. But we are going to see that used, I would expect, particularly since, and I think we're going to talk about this a little later, about because we've got so many whistleblower statutes this now, and particularly DOJ, that's an obvious statute that a prosecutor's going to use. I would direct everyone to, the sort of what I call the bread and butter for a federal prosecutor, which are the wire fraud, mail fraud, and my personal favorite, 18 U.S.C. 371, a Klein conspiracy. Even though we have all these other very specialized statutes, and I would say that we're going to see some of these cases, or maybe even a lot of them, prosecuted under wire fraud or the 371 conspiracies. They're just easier to prove, more streamlined. They are something that prosecutors use all the time, and again, it's not hard to explain to a jury, and in almost every case, at least certainly for wire fraud, I just can't think of a transaction that happens in global commerce where, where you don't have some wire that's going to give you jurisdiction where you need it. So these are sort of the key statutes to be aware of. There's a couple of more. Francesca, if you could, next slide, please. I just wanted to mention these two, IEPA and the Anti-Terrorism Act. So one of the things that Attorney General Pam Bondi rolled out was the notion that for IEPA prosecutions, while previously the National Security Division had to be looped in and have certain levels of approval for use of this, it's now, again, more decentralization. So in certain instances, U.S. Attorney's offices can proceed with de minimis notice to the National Security Division, or NSD. So again, what that means is faster process and more aggressive prosecutions. The other being the Anti-Terrorism Act, which has been out there, right? And there were two historical cases that I can think of, one involving a cement manufacturer where they were found to have been paying an associate of a terrorist organization for protection in a zone where there was, legitimately, I guess, a need for protection, but nonetheless, they were paying terrorists and, pled guilty, and there was a large fine. Another was in South America involving bananas, and the same issue of needing protection and having made payments to cartel members for protection. And I mentioned both of these because certainly with the IEPA, it's sort of, not that it's new to the U.S. Attorney's offices, but it's kind of they have newfound power, right, with this rollout. And what I know is that they're going to want to use it. So to the extent that they can, we're going to see more use of IEPA, and certainly the Anti-Terrorism Act is an area where anyone in the global supply chain or global manufacturing is really going to have proactively get a boots on the ground due diligence of who you're doing business with, and get ahead of it. And to the extent that you find that there is has been something untoward, consider voluntary self-disclosures and obviously remediation, and however appropriate that might be. So Francesca?
Okay, thank you. So now I wanted to talk about what you can do from a compliance perspective to really minimize the likelihood of a violation. So this is maybe more substantive. Brittain's going to be more process, if that's fair to say. The first thing I really want to emphasize to all of you at companies is that especially in a situation like what we have right now, where there's a lot of uncertainty and confusion and urgency. There's a lot of urgency to these problems that you're facing for trade. It's very important to make sure the tone from the top still says compliance matters. It's a little bit like I tell my children, it's easy to be nice and respectful when you're not under stress. You need to do it when you're under stress. That's when the problems happen. This is a challenging situation, and we want everyone from the C-suite to the management, middle management, to be continuing to make the point compliance matters. We want to find solutions. We want to find compliance solutions. I am not going to give you a 101 on a trade compliance program. If you email us, we have materials where you can get information about trade, like, more in the weeds. But I wanted to talk about what you've got now, what your resources are now, and very big picture, making sure you've got the program and the resources to deal with these challenges that you're going to be facing as the trade enforcement area heats up. The first thing to really think about is, do you have the human resources? Is there someone who's responsible for understanding how things are, the laws and regulations, about making decisions, about teaching others about decisions? Do you have those human resources? Do you have the data? Can you pull the data? A lot of questions are, how is this going to impact us? What if we do this? What if we do that? Where is our stuff coming from? Who's shipping it? Can you get your hands on your data pretty efficiently? And if not, this is a good time to be thinking about how to internally make that work better. Streamline where you store the data, make it easier to pull. And then software programs. Do you have tools that help you screen efficiently for third parties that might be terrorists, cartels, etc.? Do you have software that helps you look at your supply chain and map it out? Do you have good programs to help you track sort of what your products are, how they're classified, where they're going? So again, think about your resources, think about what you really need to be most effective, and don't just fix your attention on sort of the immediate question, the immediate tariff announcement that week, but this is a really important time to think big picture about trade compliance. Do you have the chops to handle this? Next important thing is education and training. I know it's hard to keep up with what's developing, even for the people whose day job it is, but there's so much out there that's confusing. This is an important time to do some training, education, so that the rest of the people in your company have a solid understanding of how these different trade issues work, so they can help identify red flags, and so that they are not, misled by something that they've read online or in some sort of app. When you have either formal procedures or you've got situational direction about how to use, how to deal with the tariffs coming from Mexico on this one product, right? Make sure you're writing it out and you're clear. You might have today's emergency, you're telling so-and-so today, you think you've got it done, but this thing's going to continue. So you need to make sure that people can always look back and say, what am I supposed to do? Okay, that. I'm supposed to do that. You need clear directions so they understand once you've solved the problem, how that problem is solved, so they can rinse, repeat. It's also a time to think about your internal audits and your assessments. Have you been doing them? You want to catch some of these percolating problems so that as enforcement goes up, you don't accidentally have some long-standing issue like that gets caught in the crosshairs. Again, many audits and assessment programs are sort of randomized, and I think that there's a time and a place for that. But right now, when there's transition, I think you want to focus your internal audits and assessments on the risks that are most likely to be targeted. Once you've kind of got that addressed, you can go back to a more randomized upkeep kind of audit. So Brittain, back to you. That was a very, very quick overview, because now we'll talk about the most exciting part, which is for all you trade compliance folks who mostly think about your agencies and civil enforcement, how do you think about criminal enforcement and how that's different, and how you should prepare for that, and how you should respond to it?
Thanks, Francesca. If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so there's two areas we're going to see, where enforcement touches down in reality. You're going to have raids on warehouses and search warrants. Those are going to be offices or other places of business. And then there are other points of contact between employees or executives at various times, either before or after a raid, or maybe not even having a raid. And we call one of those is a knock and talk. That's where a law enforcement agent will show up at the home, or probably not a place of business, but will show up at the home of an employee or executive and try to talk to them. There can also be an interaction when they're trying to serve a grand jury subpoena. And also at the same time, you'll often see cell phone seizure warrants. In other words, they may not have an arrest warrant, but they, do a knock and talk and also serve your CEO with a seizure warrant for the cell phone. So how to prepare for these risks? Next slide, please. So first off, in terms of search warrants and warehouse raids, I could give you a whole primer on how to deal with a search warrant, and I do that, and including like doing mock run-throughs. So if anyone is interested in that, please reach out. We can do things specific to your business or organization. So I can't overemphasize enough how you have to have a plan in advance, and you have to have trained your employees on it. And I don't mean reading or like going through slides. I think they really need to actually sort of walk through it, because as one would imagine, and maybe we get a little glimmer of this from television, Law and Order, Billions, when there's a search warrant, but search warrants and the arrival of law enforcement is an extraordinarily chaotic and overwhelming experience for most people. And in situations where you have a warehouse, and the first, or the office, and the first line of contact is with a receptionist or whatever. These are not people that are lawyers or even used to dealing with law enforcement, and can easily be intimidated, can think they're being helpful when they're not. And so it's important to sort of walk through before law enforcement shows up, sort of the guardrails, and so they have some confidence in how to behave when law enforcement arrives. Can I have the next slide, please? So by having a plan, I mean exactly that. You have a plan, you have a team, people that are identified with different roles. And again, I'm not going to walk through, the whole process, because again, that would be one entire seminar. But parts of the things you're going to have to think about is who's going to meet the agents, who's going to review the warrant, who's going to call counsel, and who's going to follow agents through the search to make sure that they're adhering to the scope of the search. All of these things need to be outlined for the staff in advance. Receptionist needs to know who all the contacts are so that this can go off as seamlessly as possible. I mean, there's still going to be chaos, and but you want to minimize that. You also need to have training for what not to do during these raids or search warrants. You certainly don't want to increase risks by having issues related to potential obstruction, anyone, trying to hide things or destroy things. You need to make sure that people understand that it's sort of like pencils down when the agents show up. Another key thing that you would want to train employees on is, what about when an agent asks, well, can we go in here, or can I look in that? You're going to have a team leader who's going to follow, know the warrant, or as best they can, but you need to instruct employees that you don't consent to search. The warrant is enough, and beyond that, you're not consenting. I mean, you're not going to counsel them to be rude about it, or difficult about it, but just sort of refer back to counsel. Again, training on this is very important, so that they know sort of what to say when asked.
Brittain, let me pause there just for a second, because I think it'll be very interesting for people. Why don't they want to consent to search?
So for consenting to the search, so for example, if the search is for computers and papers or what have you, and then the agent wants to go on to the into the warehouse floor, and an employee is just like, sure, go in there, then you have no ability to then later suppress what was located, because there's been consent to search, right? So if they, again, you're not going to stand in front of an agent when they say, well, we're going in there, we think our warrant allows us to do so. You can just say, well, I don't consent, and then they go in, but later you have the ability to move to suppress evidence that's seized. I mean, whether or not you'll be successful, you don't know, but again, the warrant will stand on its own. Any defects in the warrant are going to be litigated by the attorney counsel afterwards. And so you want to keep it to the warrant and not have it muddied up with, oh, well, you've got the warrant, but even without it, we just let you in, kind of thing. Like, you don't, none of that. It really just stick to the warrant and let counsel deal with anything afterwards.
And so a simple thing that employees could be told to say is just, I don't consent.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. But don't throw themselves in front of the agents and try to actually stop them. Right,
and again, this is why, in a full training on search warrants, we'd identify all the players. You're going to want a team leader who's somebody that has authority within the company, that knows, where everything is. And, employees are going to be trained to know that, like, direct it to the team leader or to company counselor, so that they don't have to be the one, standing there in front of an agent with guns and everything and telling them, no, you can't do it. But so all of these things, it really is helpful for them to know kind of what they have to do and what they don't have to do in advance. Oh,
I'm sorry, I have another question. I'm just kind of
no, that's fine.
Trying this out. If they think they're a law-abiding company and they have nothing to hide, why don't they just say sure?
Well, I mean, again, that would assume that, like, that employee knows everything about, what every other employee has done. I mean, you can't have that kind of level of knowledge. And you also don't know, granted, even though the warrant may be looking for one particular thing, and they should be returning any, let's say, electronic evidence that isn't responsive to the warrant. You just don't want to open up your books in that particular, or books office, to that level of scrutiny without legal process. I think there is the sort of tension that between, sort of cooperation and wanting to appear like a good corporate citizen, and then, being a rollover and making mistakes, and, maybe not knowing that you have an employee that did something, that you wish they had not done, and then you are exposed. So it's always better to, again, work within, the confines of a warrant with counsel. there's nothing to say that, you know, none of this needs to be confrontational or difficult. You know, be very cooperative, be very polite. You know, it's always, you know, agents will respond accordingly. You know, I mean, you may get some that are just going to always be very abrupt, but if you're, you know, it's try to keep it cooperative in terms of tone, but you don't have to like roll over for it. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
And I just wanted to sort of articulate it for people who haven't been saturated, like maybe we have, and that's like, oh yeah, of course you don't. You know? I want to kind of articulate it for people. We also have another question. It says, assuming for the purpose of this question that the companies on this call are law-abiding companies, are there industries more likely to be exposed to searches, et cetera? Do we think that certain industries or businesses will be more targeted?
Well, I would have to say that, I mean, I don't want to come out and say, oh, well, if there's a particular company that is not in favor with the administration, whether they might get more scrutiny. But I mean, we all watch the news. That certainly wouldn't surprise me. Again, industries that are going to get more scrutiny are going to be ones involved, you know, in I think the shipping and, you know, cross-border, as well as, you know, interstate within the country too. So, you know, that's trucking, you know, planes, any, you know, transportation, all of that I think is ripe for this kind of conduct, and certainly ones that may have historically potentially employed undocumented workers. I'm trying to think of some particular like products or something that might be unpopular. I mean, certainly anything that's like coming in from, if you do business with Mexico a great deal, or Chinese, you know, suppliers, obviously those are going to be scrutinized. But I, off the top of my head, I can't think of particular products that are.
You know, one thing maybe I'll add is we're talking about the context where there's a search warrant, right? So they've gotten a warrant, which means they had to have some sort of reason for it. They can't just say, well, we want to target this industry. So I think that some of the industries that are going to be more exposed are going to be the ones where we think there's going to be more sort of opportunistic fraudulent activity. So if you're importing something from China, something that's made in China, maybe like finished goods, you know, if your structure is such that the valuation might be suspect. Let's see, other industries that I think this is going to be particularly susceptible. I don't know, other than like you said, logistics providers and sort of companies involved in that. And I don't know, there's particular industries that we think are more likely to be targeted at this point.
So just finishing up on sort of things, you know, pitfalls for the unwary, I suppose, in terms of law enforcement contacts. Again, training on knowing when, you know, who should talk to agents, when you can talk to them, what you can say. I mean, many people think that they're being helpful by talking to agents. Employees need to know that they in advance that they don't have to talk to agents, that they have the right to ask for company counsel to be present, that they have the right to just direct them to company counsel. All of these things you have to train your employees on in advance, because the day of, many people's instinct is to be helpful, right? You know, particularly when somebody with a gun is there and, you know, you're a law-abiding citizen and sure, let me tell you about this. Again, it's their choice, but both the day of and afterwards, you know, because you could have a raid and then employees are approached for knock and talks within the days and weeks afterwards. They still need to know, you know, what do you have to say? Do I have to sign something? All of these are sort of topics that need to be covered, you know, in the weeds with folks beforehand, so that you don't have more damage control to do on the other end. And then again, knowing what to do before the agents leave, making sure they leave you an inventory of everything that's seized, making sure that a team leader reviews it and that it's accurate to the best and that you understand what it says. All of these kind of things are kind of a checklist that needs to be followed so that you can do damage control effectively after this has happened. Next slide. So some of this I've already spoken about, in terms of talking to law enforcement, and the 3 times or 2 times really that you might have it outside of a raid would be the knock and talks or when there's a subpoena getting served. In terms of, I would just make a note here about cell phone seizure warrants, where the person is not arrested, but you take their phone. Again, cell phone and text hygiene is just so important here, for compliance professionals. What are you using, text to communicate? What are your employees allowed to do with either their own phone or the company phone? Again, those are just treasure troves of evidence, and employees need to know that if an agent shows up at their home with a cell phone search and seizure warrant, they have to turn it over. And, it's not a let me go download all of my personal contacts or my photos or whatever. It's going. So again, preparation is key. We've talked a little bit about, the company's approach as being cooperative versus, an individual who may decline to be interviewed and so forth. And there are lots of nuances. And again, this is part of sort of a larger training episode on just kind of dealing with, representing corporations versus individuals. But again, there'll be nuances here, particularly when you're dealing with individuals who may be in a warehouse and maybe they are undocumented, or so they have a lot of, or maybe they're not undocumented, but they have something else, in their background that they don't want to answer questions on. So there's lots of different nuances that unique to each company in terms of what kind of employees you have and how you're set up that come into play here. Finally, part of going through, sort of looking at trade crimes and how to effectively defend against them is for executives and employees to sort of understand how prosecutors prove intent to commit a crime, what kind of evidence they use. And so, again, needing to know that you can't just be willfully blind. You can't just, oh, I'll never be on the list of, email list about, signing off on this bill of lading. That doesn't fly, right? As well as understanding, sort of what you should or should not be, putting in emails, apart from what you shouldn't be doing, right? But things that can look worse than they are. And all of this goes under the sort of bigger headline of kind of compliance training on appropriate and use of emails and so forth. So, and employees and executives really do need to sort of understand the bigger picture about how some of these flippant emails can come back, to haunt you, things that, facially to you, because you're in the moment dealing with, a shipper that you've been dealing with constantly, and, you're not really thinking through of how someone from the outside might look at it. It could be totally benign, but, to somebody that's investigating you, it could be a great email for them. So all of these are things that need to be flagged and sort of vetted with your team.
Going back to this one, Brittain, who does typically escort the agents? Is that usually someone pretty senior who's on site, or?
So again, it's going to be, specific to, whatever organization, right? So that's, if you think about it, who's the first person that's going to come in contact with the agents? At an office, it's going to be the person that sits at reception. At a factory, or there may be a guard, security guard station. That person's going to be the first point of contact. They're not going to be the team leader. the team leader is going to be the first person on, they should have a list, or maybe a little flashcard of all the people that they call in the order they call them. And the team leader for response will be the person that identifies the lead agent and receives the warrant. And then to the extent, depending on how big the operation is, you may need a couple of sort of co-team leaders to be able to escort agents, show them around to the property. And also one thing they'll be responsible for doing is knowing where things like confidential information is, potentially privileged, so that they can at least identify it so it can be sequestered appropriately. I mean, if you have a massive raid of a large warehouse, you are going to need ideally, right? Ideally, you're going to have enough people on the team that you can have maybe not a 1-to-1 ratio, but at least, because agents aren't seizing alone, right? You have an agent that goes in and is going to point out, okay, we've got this here, this there, and then they identify it. A second agent is going to be the one that's the seizing agent and picks it up or processes it. So it would be ideal to have one person with each search team that is there. If it's not possible, it's not possible, but again, you would have somebody go with each agent to make sure that that the scope of the warrant is adhered to, and also note what they're doing, because at this point you may not know what the raid is. Somebody has just gotten the warrant. It's been given to the team leader. Part of it would be to send it on to counsel immediately, because of course counsel's not going to be there the day of the raid. That's the perfect world, right? But it's not going to happen. So as you're walking through with the agents, you may not know what this is about. So having somebody that can monitor them and see, oh, they were really interested in this. They were really interested in containers, that we just got in, last week. They didn't care anything about the ones we got in today, so whatever that is, whatever information it is that can be captured, that's what you want to capture, again, for damage control afterwards.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question about sort of more of an ICE immigration raid. I'm going to rephrase it a little bit and ask you to tell us if there are differences in the advice you would give with respect to this type of search warrant versus an immigration warrant, a raid for that.
Sure. So, ultimately, search warrants are search warrants. Now, the difference is, in an ICE raid, they're looking for people, as opposed to possibly, they're not necessarily seizing computer systems or shipments or what have you. It's just looking for the undocumented person. Do they have a right to seize documents? Again, if they don't have if they have an arrest warrant, they can arrest the person, but that doesn't give them the right to search a classroom that isn't their sole, it's not like it's their personal room. It's somebody else's facility. So no, they don't get to do a full search in that area unless they have a search warrant. It just, if they do, again, that things can be suppressed later on. Whether they can seize documents or papers that are part of the personal effects of the person that they're arresting, again, I would be surprised if you have that specific information that they're going to be in classroom A at X time and you want to arrest them and seize their laptop and everything, you're going to have a search and seizure warrant for it. It would be, if you don't and you seize it, you're going to have a problem. So I don't know if that specifically answers your question, but the same principles apply. Obviously, employee, in an ICE raid, they're looking, again, for a person, not necessarily evidence of shipment, trade crime and so forth.
Brittain, did you have any last comments?
Again, my only comment is have a plan, be ready before they show up. And please reach out if we can be of assistance in developing a plan and training your team on executing it appropriately. And thank you all for attending.
Yes, thank you all. Our webinar series, Transition to Presidential Change, continues on April 8th at 2 p.m. And the next session will be a look at navigating supply chain disruptions. So we'll be continuing the trade theme. Sessions are held on Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Please check your inbox for invitations on the upcoming topics, and I hope that you can join us.